So, hello everyone. I'm Tomás Garnier, Artiñano, and I will be talking to you about how to build a digital brain. So, before a bit about myself, I studied biology at the University of York, and I did an Erasmus in Strasbourg. I then went to study neuroscience at the University of Helsinki, where I recently graduated. And I did my master's thesis in computational neuroscience. And that's the topic that I'm here to talk to you about today. So in neuroscience, we are trying to understand the brain, and this incredibly complex organ that sits between our ears is taking constantly information all around us, and it's processing it in a way that we can react in the best way possible to whatever inputs we receive. So, for example, we receive information from our eyes, say a change in the light of the crossing, indicating that we're allowed to walk. And how the brain does that, it's frankly incredible. As I said, the brain is really complicated, and it's made of various layers of complexity, as people say. So the brain itself is made out of these cells called neurons, and there are about 85 billion of them, and they are connected between them with loads of synapses, which are the connections between neurons. And the way that these neurons are connected is what gives it its function. So basically in order, we have synapses that connect neurons, which are connected to build circuits, and these circuits make up the brain. And the way that these circuits come together is what gives the brain its function. So in order to understand how the brain works, we need to understand all of these layers. So how neurons work and how they are connected. And that is not an easy task. As Richard Feynman said, a famous physicist and science communicator, what I cannot build, I do not understand. And what he meant by that is that we get an extra level of understanding of something when we can recreate it. And that is where modeling comes in. So in order to build a model, before that, so a model is a way of basically doing what I mentioned before, of recreating or trying to explain a particular thing or phenomenon using equations, and trying to describe what happened in a mathematical way, so we can recreate, we can describe it in really minute detail. And the way to build one of these models is first by creating observations. So we look at the world and do experiments and try and see what is happening. From these observations, we try to create an equation that describes what's going on. And so from that equation, we try to describe what we saw and these natural phenomena. And it is those explanations, that equation needs to agree with what we see in reality. And when that happens, we say that we have a good model or a functional model. And so an example of this could be an apple. So as the myth goes that the apple fell onto Newton's head and gave him the idea to how to describe gravity, we can observe an apple falling. and try to make the necessary measurements and to derive an equation, in this case, acceleration times mass equals force, and then check with reality to see if that applies. And the same way that this can be done with physics, it can be done with biology and neuroscience. But then what becomes difficult is how do we build a model, and model of what exactly? So as I said before, the brain is a bit like how to describe the brain works a bit like a Russian doll. So you can go either from a really small core of single neurons and describe them very, very well, or go to the big picture and see in cognitive models how the brain interacts and how loads of these signals are going around in the brain. So if we describe a single neuron, we can go in minute detail and describe the ion channels and the dendritic compartments, that is the branching of the cell. But then that makes it very complicated. And then if we go to the other side of the scale, then to cognitive models, we lose the detail that we want. So we just see brain waves going back and forth, but it might not be able to answer some of the questions that we have. So in the case, for example, of complex neurons, that, as I said before, these models are really detailed and can be really, really good at explaining the mechanisms behind how neurons work. They describe how ions go in and out of the cell, the concentration, and how the conditions around a neuron can affect its function. So for example, we can model the ion channels that we see there, and these control the flow of ions across the membrane, and that gives us a better understanding on how a single neuron can work, or a group of neurons works in a very specific environments. But this extra detail makes them very cumbersome and very computationally demanding. So these simulations that we run, these models that we run, they run on computers, and it takes a lot of power to model these things. And therefore, we're not able to make big circuits out of these, because they cannot be run in a normal computer. So another way would be to simplify a neuron. So once we have a good understanding of the mechanism, we can try and see like the general behavior of neurons. And so these phenomenological models, as they're called, what they just try and model is the behavior of the cell, rather than going to the minute detail of every single type of channel that is going in and out. They just kind of describe the way that a neuron works and how it would fire if it receives a certain type of input. And that makes it a lot easier to compute. So it can be much better. It can be run more efficiently in a normal computer. As an example, this is one of the equations that is used for a leaky integrate and fire neuron. And although it looks complicated, it's a relatively small equation that is just by adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing a couple of inputs. And whereas other models take loads and loads of variables, and that makes them very complicated. And just as a small side note, these two types of model are not a hard one or the other situation, but they're there's a scale between them, and you can add or remove different amounts of detail, and that can make it that can depend on what question you're trying to answer. But once we start looking beyond simple neurons, we come to more of the brain. We can expand into larger areas of the brain, or larger descriptions of the brain, and we can simulate either brain regions or brain circuits. And these are a large series of neurons that are connected between them. And as I said before, this is what we're trying to get to, how to build a larger and larger circuit so that we can understand how the architecture and how the way that these neurons are connected makes the brain work. But this is not an easy task. If simulating a brain region is very computationally demanding, simply because of the amount of neurons that there are. Even if we take simple neurons, it needs a supercomputer in order to run this. So just to give you an idea, there are about 150 million neurons in the primary visual cortex, so this area here. And each neuron has roughly 500 synapses, which is, those are a lot of connections between a lot of neurons. And it is this complexity that makes the brain fascinating, that makes the brain what we want to understand, but it makes it also difficult. And finally, we have cognitive models. So these models are very have a very kind of like sky high view of the brain, and what they do is they don't bother with specific neuronal mechanisms and how neurons fire, but they just look at how brain regions interact between them, and how firing in terms of a certain input is occurs. And these models are built in a very different way. So instead of taking data from single neurons and then building slowly upwards, they kind of go the other way and go from very high-end data of brain scans, so either functional MRI, EEG, or MEG. So EEG is EEG and MEG use electrodes and magnets to measure how different brain regions are firing in the brain. They kind of look like a helmet when you put them onto people, and then once you put people into these machines, you show them either pictures or sounds or different inputs and see how they react to them. And when you compare this interaction to a baseline, you can see how different brain regions light up or react stronger or less so. And this is what we see in the picture, for example. And after all this talking about models and how to describe the brain, you might be asking, why bother? So why should we build a model of the brain? Why should we try and recreate a brain in a computer? So after all, we don't have models, like complex models of kidneys, and we're just fine. And the reason that I think is very important, or that I think is important for the area, is that the brain is very, very complex, and it is important to understand its structure and how information is processed in it in order to actually understand it. And this might give us insight into certain diseases, especially psychiatric diseases. But we're really far away from that. So it's not realistically a short-term goal. And I think that the better reason for it is that by studying computational neuroscience, it will give us a better understanding of the brain, intelligence itself, and ourselves. And along the way, we will find useful stuff, trying to solve these problems on how to build these models will give us important findings that we were not expecting. And an example of this is CERN. So the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, it's built to crash particles at very high speeds in these conditions that simulate the beginning of the universe. And although there is no practical use for it really, other than trying to better understand well, the universe that makes us, loads of useful things have come out of that research in just simply trying to solve these questions. So things like better superconductors, better magnets, and the internet. So they were trying, in CERN, they were trying to share files in this like massive a facility that crosses the border between two countries. And they realized that they needed to share files from one building to the next. And so they built a structure that later laid the foundation for file sharing in the internet. So often it is not useful. It is not useful things don't come up as a direct easy result, but it's more of a serendipitous discovery. And in computational neuroscience, we have our own versions of CERN, let's say. So there are incredible people doing amazing work in the Allen Institute, that they're trying to compile loads of data from single neurons and making that data freely available for people to use in their models as they see fit. And then initiatives like the Human Brain Project or eBrains in Europe are trying to build more and more complex models of the brain and different brain regions in order to understand how we think. So that's I think that's a very interesting and very important goal that we're trying to achieve. And finally, I'd love to give I'd like to give thanks to the Vanni Lab. So first and foremost to Simo Vanni, my master's thesis supervisor. He is an amazing researcher, and I've had a really good time at his lab and learned a lot from him and the project. So I am really grateful for him for working with him in general, and then to other members of the lab like Henry and Iris, and all the work that they all the help that they gave me while I was working at the Vanni Lab in my project. So thanks a lot.